This lesson, we will talk about the issue, the existence or the non-existence of what is called Q. Of course, we used Q before. Let me say Q is not a radio station, although it is a radio station in Belgium, but this Q has nothing to do with it. Q normally means a lineup. To queue on, to queue in, to queue on. Has nothing to do with it. The queue we are talking about is from the German word Quelle, which means source, and it is a scientific, artificial solution for a problem that exists in a number of circles and that are not happy with what is being said before and what is being done before. And so they said we need to have more understanding. Someone jotted down the idea that in the United States of America, at the end of the last century, there is an industry. He called it an industry on material and materials that are being produced and being pushed into the theological arena of today. And so he says, therefore, we have to be very careful. So let's look at Q. Why, when, how. Let me go back to the original argument explaining what Q is supposed to be doing. There is a verbal agreement between the Gospels of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke. Material that you do not find in the book or the Gospel of Mark. So the idea is that there's supposed to be a source for that agreement. So they are looking for a source to explain the agreement between material text in Matthew and material text in Luke. Because we know that they are saying the Markan priority gives us rise to this problem, so we need to solve it. So people came up with the idea that it has to be a written document, and they could not find a written document. And since they could not find a written document, they are saying it's a document without having any proof. So what are they saying? They are saying we have a solution for a problem and you have to believe us. And when you look at the solution of the problem, you will see the solution is worse than the problem itself. But okay, let's look at it. So Q is a Q gospel, is a Q document, is a Q sayings of the gospel. Q is from Germany. But that it's just a German word. It has a whole range of sayings about Jesus. And so we know it exists because we know that Matthew and Luke are using that as a source. That is their standpoint, their point of view, their premise. That's how they look at it. So they do not agree on anything else. They say Q exists. There was a text, and then at the end of the 20th century, someone, people who had nothing to do with archaeology, they found a container, and in that container there was a text, an old text of the 4th century. It was written in Coptic, the Coptic language, and the text itself names itself, so it gives a title to itself, and the title is the Gospel of Didymus, or Didymus James. So what do we have? We have a Coptic text of the 4th century. That is what we have from the past. So what we have, we already talked about certain things about Q. Remember, it's a link between, you can almost say, a non-existing or a imaginary text. And so in the late 20th century, they found a text and said, that's it. The material we are talking about is the Gospel of Thomas. So what do we do? Well, we accept the Gospel of Thomas or we don't. Well, let me say it this way. There was 20 centuries of Christianity without the Gospel of Thomas. So do we need the Gospel of Thomas? I kind of doubt it. Excuse me, but I think I can honestly say that we can doubt the necessity of the Gospel of Thomas. But since it's there, people say, oh, now we have found the real source of the Gospel. All the other Gospels are you can put them away, and now we have it. Well, that's fine. Let's look at it. Remember, we had solutions in the past for the problems we faced with the differences and the similarities and the dissimilarities of the text of the 3 Gospels. And so we need to have an explanation. So the Q is a explanation. And then in the 20th century came the Gospel of Thomas, and the Gospel of Thomas was pinpointed as the missing link between the truth and what we have as Gospels, as what we know as Gospels today and for 2000 years. So that is what we have. And that's the problem we are facing. During the last centuries, from the 19th century on, there was a whole range of people at different universities, scholars, were trying to give a scholarly answer to the big problem of the source. And that's all fine, nothing wrong with it. But in 1838, a German called Hermann Weisse was thinking about the source, and before him someone else with the name of Schleiermacher. Excuse me, those are German names, but that's the way it is. And Schleiermacher was the one who built on another theory, and that theory was a theory of Herbert Marsh, Herbert Marsh, an Englishman in this case, and he had the idea of the existence of a narrative, a source, or sayings. So Schleiermacher, the next one in line, spoke about the logia or the logia. The missing link between Matthew and Luke are the missing source for the same materials. So we had March, we had Schleiermacher, and then we have Weisse. And he combined the materials of the two others. He started with the idea of the two-source hypothesis, in which both Matthew and Luke used Mark and a source of sayings, because they could not explain what was going on. So after a lot of discussion, they put together the idea of what is now called Q as a source for the missing link, the missing material, or the material that's there and it's not being accounted for. That is Matthew and Luke. Since they share material, they have to have the same source. And let me say, I agree on that. They must have a same source. They must have a specific source. In 1924, a study called the Study of Origins by Burlet Hilm Streeter argued that the third hypothetical source referred to M. Remember, we talked about Matthew M and Luke L. So he came up with that idea. That, you know, all is fine. So Matthew has a separate source, and we call that M, and Luke has a separate source, and we call it L. No problem. So we have Mark as a source, we have Q as a source, we have L as a source, and we have M as a source. No problem up till now. There's nothing. Yeah, I mean, you can just go like that. That is not a problem. But then the finding of the Gospel of Thomas, that some people call it the discovery. That's fine, okay? You can call it whatever you want. It's not a discovery, it's just an existing text that's being used again. But yeah, fine. So another group of people are coming in now. So now we have, for example, we have Kloppenberg, we have Mack from the American point of view, Kloppenberg from the German point of view. But Kloppenberg was also involved in what is called the Jesus Seminar. And the Jesus Seminar, they had a funny thing of doing things. They did not discuss material, although it was called a seminar. It's not something, someone brought an idea and then they listened at it. No. What happened was someone brought an idea, threw it in, or brought it in the group, and then the group voted on it. There was no discussion as such. It was just an idea, and then they voted on it. Like, it's almost saying like yes or no. Do we allow or do we not allow it? And so that's the seminar. That's the idea of the seminar. Fine, that's okay. Again, no problem. That's what they are doing. So one day they talked about the Q. One day they talked about the Gospel of Thomas, and whatever they voted. I mean, we are talking about a number of people. We are not talking about 30,000 theologians coming together and have their talk about it. No, we are talking about a small group of individuals. It started with 200 and it went down to 35. And those 35 are still doing the same thing. Maybe they stopped because, when someone brings up the idea again, then they can do it again. So that is not what we are looking for. They think they have good ideas, and it's all fine. Okay, we talked about proto-gospel, remember? And that is something, yeah, I understand. There's no problem. People making notes or taking notes, and then bringing those notes together, and then writing a text, the full text. Maybe Matthew did this, maybe Mark did it, and for Luke we know for sure he did that. So this, yeah, well, it's an example, something that happened. So the scholars always say that is called Q. And some say, well, yeah, it's called Q, but then you have M and then you have L as extra. No problem yet. But what is the nature? What is the nature of Q? Because suddenly in history you find a melting of Q and the Gospel of Thomas. That's a strange thing. Because the Gospel of Thomas is not what we would call a gospel. That is what they would call a gospel, and that is the gospel as it calls itself a gospel. Good news, well, yeah, there are many gospels, there are many good news. Even in written form, you have a whole range. But you only have a small range, 4 in all, that are accepted by the church as being the gospel presentation as we need it as a church, divinely ordained. So you can have an idea saying Q exists, and with the extension, the possible extension of M and L, or you can say no, Q does not exist. That's another way of looking at it. But when Q does not exist, you have to give an explanation of it. So you have Q exist because there's a striking similarity between Matthew and Luke, even outside of the material being used from the book of Mark. So it's clear there must be a source. So let's just take that on board, okay? That is a good idea. That's the case for. The case against is very simple. There's no such a text. And the second thing is, nobody in the early church ever wrote about the Q text. So there's a good chance Q never existed as a separate text. I'm not saying Q did not exist, I'm saying as a separate text. Or maybe Q was something else as what people think Q is. Or maybe Q is what we found in the Gospel of Thomas. So in today's theological understanding, we have a huge problem in that sense. Okay, you have a whole range of people, very famous theologians, who are saying, outspokenly saying, that they are against the idea of Q. And on the other hand, you have a group of people, also outspoken, well-known theologians in the 19th and 20th century, speaking out and saying, yes, Q is the solution. So that's what we have as introduction to the Q problem. Someone at the end of the 20th century said we need to clear our voices and say and speak with one voice as evangelicals. And he wrote material for us. And sometimes he's funny, sometimes he's very stern, sometimes he's even very difficult. He starts with saying the name we used, Mac from the States, Claremont, Southern California. He was a professor of New Testament in the School of Theology of that university. And he wrote what is called a best-selling book about the origins of Christianity. And he says, Max says, this is the end of traditional Christianity. Traditional Christianity will be wiped away with what I have to say. Well, that's big. That's big. Of course, we are 25 years later, and nothing of this kind is actually happening. Okay. So he said we need, before we can talk about whatever we are talking about when we speak about the Gospels, we need to find that source. And if we find the source, we have to bring it together so we can use it as a source and start all over again. Well, that's great. Yeah, it looks good. Okay, so what did they find? Remember, they found the Gospel of Thomas, and they equate it with the Logia, and they equated it with Q. So the Logia is Q, and Q is the Logia. Q is Thomas, and Thomas is Q and Logia. Fine. Okay, but the problem is that in this text, we don't have a Sermon on the Mount, we don't have the Beatitudes, we don't have the Golden Rule, we don't have the Lord's Prayer, we don't have the resurrection of Christ, we don't have the death of Christ, we don't have the birth of Christ. It looks like we are missing a lot. Well, from the other point of view, they say, no, we are not missing a lot. The apostles invented a lot and added things to the gospel which should not be there. Now we have the original. Yeah, of course. When you say that a 4th century document is original, or more original than the 1st century documents or manuscripts of the Gospels, then I don't understand how come you are a scholar. Because scholarly spoken, I'm not going to say it, but I'm thinking it. I think it's nonsense. However, we are talking about famous people, people who have best-selling books, who wrote a lot of material about it. They know much more about Q and so on as what I know and what you know together. But I don't know whether they are really, truly, fundamentally right, because they are aiming for something, and that aim is, listen to what I'm saying, that aim is a non-Christian gospel. I say that again, a non-Christian gospel. So they are actually taking Christianity out of the gospel out of Christianity. They don't see Jesus as the Christ, as the anointed one. Oh, because why? Well, the Gospel of Thomas doesn't see it like that. So if the Gospel of Thomas doesn't see it like that, then it's not true. Everything was added instead of. So it's not, Jesus is not the anointed one. He's not the Messiah. He's not the Redeemer. There's no such a thing as a crucifixion. And he's not the Son of God. And he didn't rise from the dead. So what are we looking for? What are we speaking of? What are we saying? There are a number of verses in Luke and in Matthew that scholars have identified as Q material. Actually 235 in all. The technique is kind of questionable, but okay. Some say 200, some say 235. Some say it is a projection, or some say, well, the sources are there. Whether they are written or oral, they are the sources. So you have a group of people, and the writer of the article calls them Q partisans. So from the party of Q. So if you're not from the party of Q, then you're outside of them. And when they speak of them, they mean us. So that is it. And so a whole range of what we call liberal theologians, they say, you see, they were always lying to us. And now we have the proof that they lied to us. The gospel is not the gospel. The gospel is an invention. The gospel is the gospel of Thomas. That's fine. Let's look at it. Who is the Q community they are speaking of? Let me explain that. They say the Q community is a group of people in the time of Jesus who lived in Galilee and followed certain rules of Jesus literally. For example, they were poor. They said, don't take a second pair of sandals, so they didn't. Don't take an extra tunic, so they didn't. So they walked around and went around, and they were in the line of the Greek philosophers. They were saying that Jesus was also like that. So they followed Jesus to the letter. That's what the Q partisan claims to have found in Galilee. Those are the Galilean, that's the Galilean brand of, theological brand of Christianity. Someone else said, similar to that, the predominant theological brand of Christianity in Egypt was Gnosticism. That has been proven wrong. And there is no proof of this Galilean group the Q community. The reason for the Q partisans saying this, that there was a group of people like that, is because they are fed up with the bloodshed of Jesus dying at the cross, being tortured and then hang on the cross. That is not something we don't like. And you know, the thing is, it is not mentioned in the Gospel of Thomas. So what do we have? We have a group of people claiming that the book of Mark is closest to those Galilean community, of which we don't know. We have no proof that they ever existed. But they say that's what it is. So let me be frank, and I do not believe them. So the problem with Q is always that it's hypothetical. There was no proof, and even if you have a proof, like the Gospel of Thomas, we don't know whether that's the proof they are looking for. But they use that as an excuse to do so. So you have a whole range of what is called Q scholars, people who know everything, upside, inside, left, right, east, west, north, and whatever that's missing there. But they are saying things that cannot be proved. We cannot disprove it, but that's not the issue, okay? They have to prove that such a community existed, and they can't. So the text we are having, the text of the book of Thomas, although it's claimed to be Q, what do we have? So we have Q, and we have the Q community, we have the Q text, we have the Q records, but it is still an hypothesis. It is still an hypothesis. If Jesus was not the Messiah, then he was what the Jews call a sage. And so he went around talking to the people, trying to influence them and trying to win them for his ideas. Yeah and no. He was not trying, but he was doing it. And to say that the book of Mark is closest to them is invalid, because the book of Mark is a gospel and the book of Thomas is not a gospel. So what do we have? We are working with an unequal yoke. And for the theologians in the 19th, 20th century, it was like, you know, now we finally found it. But it was not true. They did not find it. So they are still trying what they call reconstruct the text of Q. And they are doing that. Well, they did that actually in an international Q project. So they brought the smartest of the people, of the Q people, together and said, okay, let's go for it. So what did they do? They worked on the idea of what Bultmann proclaimed, you know, the demythologizing. And so they used the demythologizing method to the Q text. I will give you an example. When the Bible says that that Jesus healed sick people, the Greek word is therapeutic. So they said Jesus took care of the sick people. So they are cutting off what they think is not biblical. What they think is not biblical. When you read your Bibles, when you read your New Testament, when you read the Gospels, you find Jesus is doing that. You know, there are at least 30 to 40 stories of miracles in the Gospels. So we know that Jesus did things that were, let me say it, abnormal, supernatural, above human, divine. But when you cut off the divine, you only have humanity. You have a sociological thing to do, and that's what the people wanted to have, because sociologically you can control that. Because sociology is, you can almost say, sociology is psychology in a group. That's sociological issues. Okay, so fine. But do you really give an explanation of the gospel? And I say no to that. It took them quite a long time to get the material of what now is called the Thomas Gospel, and to copy it and then to translate it into English. That is, by the way, only done 25 years ago. We are not talking about hundreds of years. We are talking about a very short-term thing. There's an institute called the Institute for Antiquity and Christianity, located in a whitewashed building in the Claremont campus, where we find the Q, the International Q Project too. Not in the same building, but in another building, because they don't get along too well. But they are trying to reconstruct Q, and you know, they are finding things, and some are kind of difficult to understand. The reconstruction text as a whole follows the sequential order in which Q material appear in the book of Luke. Luke, because they say Luke is thought to have tampered less with the Q structure. Luke has tampered less with the Q structure. So although the wording of the reconstructed passages is derived from about 50% from Luke and 50% from Matthew. So if Luke and Matthew are so different, and Luke is the better half, so why do you only have 50%? You would have 80%, 90%, but no, you have 50%. So even when they say it, they don't work on the same level. So the publication of 1,000 pages of the material began last spring, that is in 95. And so they are publishing before the end of the century all the material, and again a 300-page volume with hundreds of words of Q will be or is being published in 1998. The thing is, when you read the text and you go back to the original text of what is known as the Gospel of Thomas, it is the cut-off text we have. So they are actually undoing what the person was trying to do when he wrote that material. He's not one of the apostles, certainly not, because we know that's not, because the text is way too young, at least 300 years too young for it. So we know that person probably was a believer who tried to recollect material into a form that was acceptable to him and to the churches there. Maybe it was sayings that people knew about Jesus. Well, you have to understand 300 years later it's kind of difficult to say which exactly was said by Jesus. But, so you have the partisans, the Q partisans, saying it differently. They don't like real believers, and they said, you know, we have to cut off, and we have to fill in a religion with a new content. Remember the Q hypothesis arose from an attempt to solve a biblical, or a what we call now the synoptic problem. So it was a problem and they tried to solve it. Remember, the Gospel of John is different. And remember, take on board that what we have is, again, important. A small number of material from Mark is unique to Mark. Only a small, because 90% is being used by Matthew and Luke. So there is a literary similarity. That's what we said before, and I think that's clear. In the beginning of the 5th century, when Augustine, some call him Father Augustine, some call him Saint Augustine, it's just Augustine, a man, a Christian man, who was doing certain things for the Christian church at that time. And that time was linked, or that time is linked to what is now called the Roman Catholic Church. So that he said something about it. He gave a solution. That solution stands for a long time. I mean, he was the one who said that Matthew is the first being written, but it was written in Hebrew. Remember, and then it's out of the equation for a very long time, until in the 19th century they came up with some material. They were trying to find again with Mr. Weiss from the University of Leipzig. He was also the one who proposed the Markan priority. Very good idea. And then he told about the different sources they needed, and then he came up with the idea of Q, and that is being said today almost everywhere. You will find that idea of Q. So remember, we talked about the several possibilities. We are not going to go into that. Again, remember there was also an idea put that Matthew and Luke did not know each other, and they did not use each other's material. So wonderfully, uniquely, they used the same material without knowing it from each other, and they used the same sentence, they used the same format, they used the same order. They didn't know each other. Well, let me say this. I don't think that's a good explanation, because then you have to have divine intervention from God to do so. But what do you do with Mark then? Because there's no divine intervention there, because he is missing a whole range of materials. So he didn't listen to the Spirit well enough, so he must have been mistaken by taking away so many things. So I don't think that is what you can say. That's absolutely not something we will go to. Let's look at some more of the Q material. Of course, every solution has its problem, and every solution is always linked to a smaller section of the theological equation. So not always everything was accepted, and certainly not by everyone, even the most famous people. I heard things in the 60s and the 70s, and even today they are not being taught anymore. Why? Because nobody was listening? No, there were many people listening, but the arguments were not as persuasive as the people thought it was. Anyway, so remember that there used to be a lot of theories about Christianity. We would call that conservative Christianity, and you can call Gnostic Christianity. You could have this specialized group in Galilee, but there's no specific proof. The only thing we have is that we have a whole range of people being mentioned in church history, and of course you have deviations, heretical material. Somebody called it the Roman Catholic frippery as popes in veneration of Mary. You know, that is not what we are looking for. We are looking for the gospel itself. So not what came out of it, but the gospel itself. How can we be sure that the gospel we have is the gospel of Jesus Christ, the gospel that God intended us to have? Okay. Even with people from Harvard and from other American universities and from European universities and from Swiss universities, with all their theories, Robinson and Custer and Bauer and Robert E. Brown, Raymond E. Brown, sorry. Yeah, all fine. Except what we have is, we have a problem, and we need to have a salvation problem. We need to solve it because there's something missing here. What is missing? Okay, let me give you my idea. Let me give you my idea about Q. When you have Mark as a starting point, and you have Matthew and Luke borrowing heavily from from Mark, and Matthew and Luke knew each other, then we have a full circle. Except we still have to have an explanation about how come the similarities between Matthew and Luke are so clear that we need to have an explanation. I will give you one. Mark first, Luke second, Matthew last. We solve the whole problem. Because Luke explicitly says that he did his homework. And from Mark we know, because it's already being written in the 4th decade. So it all fits together. We have an explanation for Mark, Luke, and Matthew. We have an explanation of Luke and Matthew. And we have a theologically sound material, and we have an explanation for all the separate problems. So priority of Mark, Luke 1 verses 1 to 4 explains it, and Matthew borrows material from Luke and from Mark. And of course, he is also an eyewitness, so he can bring in material that was not being used before. So that is the solving of the problem of the issue of what is called the Gospel of Thomas, or Q.